The flight no one will forget. The morning air at LaGuardia Airport was heavy with noise, footsteps, rolling suitcases, and impatient voices echoing across the departure gates. At gate B7, a man stood out like a shining statue among the sea of travelers. His name was Richard Hale, a millionaire tech mogul, known across business journals for his billion-dollar empire. His presence radiated wealth. The perfectly tailored charcoal suit, Italian silk tie, polished leather shoes, and the platinum wedding band on his finger that he hadn't removed even after his wife passed away. People whispered when they saw him, some recognizing his face from magazines, others simply sensing power by the way he carried himself with cold confidence. But today, Richard's polished exterior cracked around the edges. His 9-year-old son, Ethan, walked beside him, hands pressed tightly against his ears, rocking slightly on his heels as if every sound in the terminal was a storm crashing over him. Ethan was a beautiful boy with sandy blonde hair, but his eyes darted with fear and discomfort at the chaos. He wore designer clothes that looked stiff against his small frame, as though every fabric fiber scratched his sensitive skin. Richard's jaw tightened each time his son paused mid-step to rock or flinched at the overhead announcements. He hated being watched, hated the pity in people's eyes, and most of all hated the whispers. That's Richard Hale. His wife died last year. Poor kid. Must be hard raising a special needs child alone. Richard led Ethan toward the jet bridge. As always, they boarded first class. As always, Mr. Hale, the gate agent said with a smile. Richard responded with a curt nod, one hand resting on his son's shoulder. Ethan twitched under the touch but didn't pull away. Inside, the cabin crew greeted them with exaggerated courtesy, seating them in 2A and 2B, the plush first. Class seats reserved for the wealthy. Richard immediately pulled out his phone, scrolling through a mountain of emails while Ethan pressed against the window, tracing invisible shapes on the glass. Meanwhile, back in the economy line, a boy no one noticed clutched his faded blue backpack. His name was Malik Johnson, a 12-year-old black boy from the Bronx. It was his first flight ever. His clothes were simple, clean jeans, a crisp polo shirt his mother had ironed twice despite the permanent stain at the collar. His mother was in the hospital, too weak to care for him anymore, so Malik was flying alone to live with an aunt he barely knew. His backpack carried everything he owned that mattered: a change of clothes, a notebook filled with doodles, and a small collection of toy cars he had treasured since the age of 5. The boarding pass trembled in his hand as the gate agent smiled kindly. "First time flying, sweetie?" she asked. Malik nodded, swallowing his nerves. He remembered his mother's weak but proud voice the night before. "You represent our family, Malik. Hold your head high. You're just as good as anybody else on that plane." When he finally reached his seat, 27C, all the way in the back near the bathrooms, the air smelled of recycled plastic and industrial cleaners. A large man muttered impatiently when Malik squeezed past him. "Kids these days," the man grumbled. Malik tried to make himself small, pressing his backpack under the seat and whispering, "Sorry." In first class, Richard was already on edge. Ethan began his tapping routine on the armrest, 7 times fast, 3 times slow, then repeat. Richard tried to stop him. "Ethan, not today," he muttered sharply, his hand pressing against his son's. Ethan pulled away violently, his eyes wide with fear. The low rumble of the engine starting up vibrated through the cabin, and Ethan's rocking grew faster. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice boomed over the intercom, "we're experiencing a minor seating issue in economy. A few passengers will be reseated." Moments later, a flight attendant approached Malik. "Honey, we need to move you. This row has a mechanical problem." Malik clutched his backpack nervously and followed her. To his shock, she led him past economy, past the dividing curtain, into premium economy, just a few rows behind first class. "You're lucky," she said with a smile. "This is the last available seat." Malik's eyes widened at the bigger, cleaner seat. For the first time, he felt like maybe this trip wasn't so bad. But just then, Ethan's whimper cut through the air. The safety demonstration had started, the attendants' voices deliberately loud so passengers could hear clearly. For Ethan, it was unbearable. He slammed his palms against his ears, rocking furiously. Richard tried noise-canceling headphones, but Ethan thrashed away, knocking them to the floor. The flight attendants exchanged worried glances. The whispers began. "Can't he control his kid? This is going to be a long flight. A heavy-set businessman snapped, I paid $4,000 for this seat. Unacceptable. And then, as the engines roared louder, Ethan screamed, a piercing primal scream that rattled the entire first-class cabin. He began hitting himself, fists pounding his thighs, then his own face. Gasps filled the cabin. Stop him, someone cried. He's hurting himself. Richard grabbed his son's wrists, panic replacing his usual cool authority. Ethan, please stop. His voice broke, and for the first time, the millionaire looked helpless. From his seat in premium economy, Malik watched with wide eyes. He saw more than chaos. He saw something familiar. The rocking, the fists, the words, too loud, too loud, too loud. It was exactly like his cousin Marcus back home, who was autistic too. Malik's heart pounded. His aunt had taught him how to help Marcus through these storms, how to speak softly, how to meet him where he was. But this was different. That was a powerful rich man up there. Would he even listen to a poor kid from the Bronx? The passengers' voices grew louder. Get him off the plane, one demanded. Another muttered, people like that shouldn't even be flying first class. The humiliation on Richard's face was unbearable as he tried and failed to calm his son. The attendants whispered about restraints. Richard's face turned pale. His boy, restrained like an animal. It was then that Malik stood. His knees trembled, but something stronger than fear pushed him forward. He moved slowly down the aisle, slipping past the curtain. Everyone stared as the poor boy approached the chaos of first class. The millionaire glared as if ready to push him away, but Malik's eyes weren't on Richard. They were on Ethan. Kneeling down beside the shaking boy, Malik whispered in the gentlest voice, It's okay. I know it's too loud. I know it hurts. You're not alone. I'm here now. From his backpack, he pulled out a tiny red toy car. Its paint was chipped, the wheels crooked, but in Malik's hand, it was a lifeline. For the first time since takeoff, Ethan's screams faltered. His teary eyes flickered toward the toy, his breathing catching. The entire cabin froze, holding its breath. And that was the moment everything began to change. The boy with the toy car, the cabin was still buzzing with tension as Malik held out the little red toy car. Ethan's cries slowed just slightly, his chest still heaving but his fists loosening. He stared at the chipped paint, the crooked wheels, and for a moment the overwhelming storm inside him paused. Richard blinked in disbelief, torn between confusion and anger. Who was this boy? Why had the flight attendants even let him step into first class? Son, you need to return to your seat, one attendant whispered urgently, though her voice carried no conviction. She had seen what none of them could ignore. Ethan's screaming was softening. The passengers who had been demanding restraints and even suggesting turning the plane around now watched in silence, curiosity overtaking judgment. Malik knelt lower, making himself small, unthreatening. It's okay, he said softly, eyes locked on Ethan instead of the millionaire father. You don't have to be scared. Look, see this car? It's safe. You can hold it if you want. His voice was steady, the same voice he had used countless times with his cousin Marcus when the grocery store lights were too bright or when the subway screeched too loud. He wasn't a doctor, wasn't trained, but he understood. He cared. Ethan's small hand trembled before reaching out. He didn't take the toy immediately. He brushed his fingertips against the faded red paint, then pulled back, then reached again. Finally, he gripped it tightly, holding it against his chest. His rocking slowed. His sobs softened. The screaming that had filled the cabin like thunder melted into a shaky whimper. The transformation was so sudden, so visible, that even the grumbling businessman who had demanded silence sat back in stunned silence. The judgmental whispers faded. A woman in the next row whispered, My God, he's calming down. Richard's throat felt dry. Hours of expensive therapy sessions, months of specialist advice, and none of it had stopped moments like these. Yet here was a poor black boy, no older than 12, kneeling on the floor of first class with nothing but a toy car, doing what wealth and status never could. His pride wrestled with gratitude, his instinct to protect his son battling his discomfort at the idea that help had come from a stranger who looked so out of place in the polished cabin. You should go back now, Richard muttered stiffly, his voice low, almost defensive. But Malik didn't move. His eyes stayed on Ethan, his hand resting gently on the carpet to show he wasn't going anywhere unless Ethan was safe. "I'll go when he's okay," Malik whispered, not out of defiance, but simple truth. For a moment, Richard wanted to snap at him, to remind him of the rules, of class, of boundaries. But then Ethan's trembling fingers turned the toy car gently over in his hand, and for the first time in weeks, Richard saw his son's face relax. Not a smile, not yet, but a tiny crack of peace, and that was enough to make Richard's words die in his throat. The cabin was silent now, the hum of the engines the only sound. Passengers who had been annoyed were leaning forward in awe. A child who minutes ago had been seen as a disruption, a burden, was suddenly just a little boy again, soothed by the kindness of another child who had no reason to step forward except compassion. One flight attendant crouched beside Richard, her eyes soft. "Sir, maybe let him stay for a while," she suggested gently. Richard hesitated, torn between appearances and reality. He had built his entire life on control, on never appearing weak, on solving problems with money. Yet here was a problem money couldn't solve, and the answer came from a poor kid who carried broken toys in his bag. Ethan pressed the car against the window, tracing invisible roads across the glass, as if the sky outside was a racetrack only he could see. His breathing steadied, the screaming was gone, and for the first time since they boarded, Richard allowed himself to exhale. Malik sat quietly beside the seat, careful not to overwhelm. He didn't need thanks. He didn't need recognition. All he wanted was for Ethan to feel safe, the same way he always wished Marcus could feel safe when the world was too loud. And in that moment, without realizing it, Malik had become the quiet hero of the flight. But while the storm had passed, the lesson was only beginning. The Millionaire's walls began to crack. For several long minutes, the cabin remained in fragile peace. Ethan held the chipped red toy car in both hands, as if it were treasure. His shoulders no longer shook violently, his rocking slowed into a gentle sway. The storm inside him had quieted, though the world around still buzzed with low murmurs. Malik stayed crouched beside the seat, careful not to crowd him, careful not to make any sudden moves. He knew that silence was sometimes the best comfort. Richard Hale sat frozen in his leather seat, unable to tear his eyes away from his son. Relief pulsed through him like air after drowning, yet the relief was tangled with something else, something he didn't like to name: shame. He was a man who solved impossible problems in boardrooms, who had built his empire from the ground up with ruthless focus, who was used to commanding respect in every room he entered. But right now, all his wealth, power, and pride had failed him. And a boy from economy class, skinny, shy, clothes far from luxury, had done what he could not. The passengers, too, were processing what they had just witnessed. Some who had been quick to judge looked down in embarrassment. A few who had demanded the flight turn around now avoided Richard's eyes. And somewhere in the back, a soft voice whispered, "Maybe that boy saved us all." A flight attendant finally broke the silence, crouching near Malik. "Sweetheart, you did amazing, but you should return to your seat." Her words were kind, yet hesitant. She had seen how Ethan's grip tightened whenever Malik shifted away. "I can stay," Malik whispered, glancing at Richard. If it's okay." For a long moment, Richard said nothing. His jaw worked, his throat tight, his pride fighting the answer he didn't want to give. He should have been the one to calm Ethan. He should have been the hero in his son's eyes. Yet here was this child offering help without expectation. Richard finally exhaled and gave the smallest nod. "Stay, for now." Ethan pressed the toy car against the window again, his lips moving softly, whispering words only he could understand. Malik leaned closer, speaking in the same gentle tone. "That's the road, huh? You're making a track." Ethan's eyes flicked toward him just for a heartbeat, then back to the window. For Ethan, it was progress. For Richard, it was a miracle. The millionaire's hands trembled as he loosened the tight grip on his son's wrists. He leaned back slowly, his polished exterior cracking further with every second. His eyes burned, though he refused to let tears fall in front of strangers. He had fought too long to build the armor around himself, too long to prove that money could cover every weakness. But here was proof it could not. In the rows behind, passengers exchanged looks, their expressions softened now with quiet respect. The same businessman who had shouted earlier sank back into his seat, silenced not by force, but by the sight of compassion overcoming chaos. The cabin was no longer hostile. It was humbled. Richard turned his eyes to Malik. For the first time, he really saw him. Not just as a poor boy from economy, not as an interruption, but as someone who carried a strength no money could buy. "What's your name?" Richard asked, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard from him. "Malik," the boy answered softly, almost unsure if he was allowed to speak. Richard nodded slowly, his gaze heavy with thoughts he didn't yet have words for. His world had always been built on titles and wealth, but now the name of a boy with nothing had just become unforgettable. As the engines hummed steadily and the clouds drifted past the windows, the plane carried more than passengers. It carried the weight of a lesson beginning to unfold. A lesson about humility, about respect, about how sometimes the greatest wisdom comes not from the powerful, but from the overlooked. And though Richard didn't know it yet, this was only the start of how Malik would change everything. The questions no one asked. The plane soared higher into the clouds, the cabin bathed in a sea, after calm. Ethan still clutched the battered toy car, running his fingers over the chipped paint as though it anchored him to safety. Every now and then, de pronto, un aplauso aislado se escuchó en la cabina. Luego otro y otro más, hasta que un grupo de pasajeros comenzó a aplaudir abiertamente. No era por el avión, ni por la tripulación. Era por Malik, el niño pobre que había logrado lo que todos daban por perdido. Richard sintió que algo dentro de él se rompía definitivamente. Sus ojos se llenaron de lágrimas y esta vez no las ocultó. Giró hacia Malik y dijo con voz entrecortada: "Gracias, no tengo palabras". Malik lo miró, serio pero con ternura infantil. "No me dé las gracias a mí, señor, solo escúchelo a él". Richard volvió la vista hacia Ethan, que lo miraba con ojos todavía asustados, pero más tranquilos que nunca. Por primera vez en mucho tiempo, el millonario entendió. Su hijo no necesitaba dinero, necesitaba presencia, paciencia y amor. La turbulencia terminó. El avión se estabilizó. La calma regresó a la cabina, pero nadie volvió a ver a Malik de la misma manera. El niño que había subido con una mochila rota y un coche viejo ahora era respetado por todos, incluso por aquellos que lo habían despreciado minutos antes. Richard, con voz firme pero emocionada, se inclinó hacia él y le preguntó: "¿Cuál es tu nombre?". Malik dudó un segundo, como si no creyera que importara. Luego respondió con sencillez: "Malik Johnson, señor". Richard repitió el nombre en silencio, grabándolo en su mente. Ese nombre, estaba seguro, no lo olvidaría jamás. El resto del vuelo transcurrió en una calma inesperada. Ethan, aún con el cochecito entre sus manos, se quedó observando la ventanilla como si por primera vez pudiera disfrutar del cielo. Malik, cansado pero sereno, se acomodó en el asiento a su lado. Nadie se atrevió a interrumpir aquel silencio lleno de significado. Richard no apartaba la mirada de los dos. Durante años, había intentado proteger a Ethan con dinero, con especialistas, con lujos. Pero en ese instante comprendí, a la verdad más dura. Había olvidado escuchar. Y ahora, un niño desconocido le estaba mostrando lo que realmente significaba ser padre. Cuando el avión aterrizó, muchos pasajeros se levantaron con prisa, ansiosos por salir. Pero algo diferente flotaba en el aire. Varias miradas se dirigían hacia Malik, ya no con desdén, sino con respeto. Algunos incluso sonrieron tímidamente al verlo. El hombre del reloj caro, incapaz de sostener la vergüenza, salió sin mirar atrás. Richard esperó a que todos avanzaran antes de levantarse. Se inclinó hacia Malik y habló con voz baja pero firme. "Quiero agradecerte lo que hiciste, no solo por Ethan, sino también por mí". Malik lo miró confundido. Yo solo quería ayudar. Lo lograste, respondió Richard. Hiciste lo que yo no supe hacer durante años. Salieron juntos de la cabina. En el pasillo del aeropuerto, mientras la multitud avanzaba, Richard notó algo. La ropa de Malik, limpia pero desgastada, sus zapatos viejos, la mochila rota que parecía a punto de deshacerse. Preguntó con suavidad. ¿Viajas solo? Malik asintió. Mi mamá está enferma. Voy a vivir con mi tía. La sinceridad en su voz golpeó a Richard como una verdad imposible de ignorar. Ese niño, que había dado tanto sin pedir nada, estaba cargando una vida llena de dificultades. Richard se agachó hasta quedar a su altura. Escúchame, Malik. No voy a dejar que desaparezcas de mi vida. Hoy me enseñaste algo que nadie más pudo enseñarme, que la grandeza no está en el dinero, sino en el corazón. Malik frunció el ceño, incrédulo. ¿De verdad lo dice? Richard asintió con solemnidad. Quiero ayudarte. No sé cómo aún, pero lo haré. Tú cambiaste mi manera de ver a mi hijo y al mundo. En ese momento, Ethan se aferró a la mano de Malik, como si no quisiera soltarlo. Su sonrisa tímida fue la confirmación más poderosa. Un grupo de pasajeros que había sido testigo de todo se detuvo, a mirar. Una mujer mayor murmuró, «Ese niño merece todo el respeto». Richard, sin importarle las miradas, tomó la mano de Malik y la levantó como si declarara algo frente a todos. His lips moved in small murmurs, whispering sounds only he could understand. Malik stayed quietly beside him, close enough to offer presence but never too close to overwhelm. It was a balance he had learned the hard way, watching his cousin Marcus ride through storms no one else seemed to understand. Richard sat in silence, his back rigid against the leather seat. His mind was a storm of its own, louder than the jet engines. For years he had shielded Ethan with money, therapists, tutors, specialists, gadgets, everything wealth could provide. Yet in this small moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the kindness of a boy who had nothing but patience, empathy, and a toy car. Richard's chest tightened with an unfamiliar weight, shame, gratitude, fear. He wasn't sure which one cut deeper. A woman across the aisle finally broke the heavy silence. "That boy saved your son," she said softly, though her words carried across the cabin. Her eyes were kind, but there was truth in them, truth that Richard couldn't ignore. Other passengers nodded. The same people who had muttered about restraint or demanded the plane turn around now looked at Malik with something close to awe. Some even clapped lightly as if this poor boy had performed a miracle in front of them. Richard cleared his throat, his pride choking him. Yes, he helped, he admitted stiffly, his words dragged out like stones. He hated how small his voice sounded, but even more, he hated how true it was. One flight attendant crouched near Malik, her tone gentle. "Sweetheart, you must be very good with kids. How did you know what to do?" Malik's eyes flickered nervously. He wasn't used to people listening to him, let alone praising him. "My cousin," he whispered. "He's like him. Sometimes the world gets too loud. You just gotta make it smaller. Make it safe." His words were simple, but they carried a wisdom far beyond his years. The passengers leaned in, as if the boy had revealed a secret the adults had missed their entire lives. Richard stared at him. A lump formed in his throat he couldn't swallow. This boy, this poor black kid who didn't even belong in first class, was teaching him how to be a father. The thought burned, yet beneath the sting was something unexpected. Respect. Ethan turned suddenly, his gaze meeting Malik's for just a second. His lips parted, and in a voice barely audible, he whispered, "Car." The single word, fragile as glass, made Richard's eyes sting. His son rarely spoke during moments like this, yet somehow this stranger had reached him. Malik smiled softly, nodding. "Yes. Car. Your car." He didn't make it a big deal. He didn't celebrate. He simply mirrored Ethan's calm, giving him space to hold on to the progress without pressure. It was a lesson Richard had never grasped. Sometimes silence was more powerful than speeches. The flight attendants exchanged amazed glances. The passengers, once restless, now leaned back with quiet reflection. For the first time, the cabin didn't see Ethan as a problem, but as a child. Just a boy who needed understanding. and all because another child had reminded them how to look at him. Richard's polished armor cracked further. He shifted in his seat, leaning forward, his voice low. "Malik," he said carefully, as though testing the name. "Where are you flying to?" The boy hesitated, then answered quietly. "To my aunt. My mom, she's sick. Too sick to take care of me right now." His words were simple, almost flat, but they carried the weight of 1,000 storms. Richard's chest clenched. The boy who had just saved his son's dignity was carrying his own burden, heavier than anyone should at 12. No one spoke for a moment. Even the cynical businessman who had shouted earlier lowered his gaze. Malik's honesty did something in the air. It stripped away judgment and left only humanity. Richard swallowed hard, guilt pressing against his pride. Here he was, drowning in embarrassment over whispers, while this boy was quietly surviving a life far more difficult than first-class stares. For the first time in years, Richard Hale, millionaire, mogul, master of control, felt small, and in that smallness something new flickered inside him. Humility. The engines hummed steadily as the plane cut through the sky, but inside Richard's chest, the walls he had built so carefully began to crumble. Because sometimes the hardest truth is not that others misjudge you, but that you've misjudged everyone else. And Malik, with nothing but patience and a toy car, was showing him exactly that. A mirror in the sky. The hum of the engines became the background to something more fragile, silence filled with meaning. Ethan, calmer now, rolled the toy car gently along the edge of his tray table, whispering a rhythm that only he understood. His body swayed softly, no longer thrashing, no longer lost. Malik sat beside him still, his small frame grounded in patience. He didn't fidget. He didn't push. He simply stayed. And in that stillness, he offered something no therapy or wealth had ever given Ethan: acceptance without conditions. Richard watched with an intensity that unsettled him. For years, he had battled with his son's meltdowns, through expensive programs, countless therapists, even medications. Every time he approached it like a business crisis to be solved with control, with precision, with force. And every time, he failed. But this boy, this child from the Bronx, had done it with nothing but empathy and a toy car. The truth dug at Richard's pride, but it also revealed something he had never allowed himself to admit. Maybe it wasn't Ethan who needed to change. Maybe it was him. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, as though reflecting on their own earlier words. The businessman who had demanded silence cleared his throat, muttering, "Didn't expect that." His voice held no anger now, only a grudging respect. A woman whispered to her husband, "That boy taught us all something." Small ripples of realization spread through the cabin like stones dropped into water. Richard leaned closer to Malik, lowering his voice. How did you know to do that?" It wasn't a question he usually asked anyone. Richard Hale didn't ask for help, but now he needed the answer. Malik hesitated, his eyes flickering nervously between Richard and Ethan. "My cousin," he said quietly. "He's autistic too. When he gets overwhelmed, people yell, or stare, or get mad. It makes it worse. My aunt taught me to listen, to make things smaller, softer." His words were plain, yet they struck Richard like lightning. This boy had learned compassion not from wealth, not from power, but from struggle. Richard's throat tightened. He had spent millions chasing solutions, and here sat a child who carried wisdom born of survival. For the first time, Richard felt envy, not of Malik's possessions, for he had none, but of Malik's gift, the ability to reach his son in a way he never could. Ethan turned suddenly, his eyes lifting for a fleeting moment to meet Richard's. In his hand, the toy car rolled slowly, steadied by small fingers. And then, softly, brokenly, he whispered another word. Safe. Just one word, but it shattered Richard's defenses. He closed his eyes, the weight of tears pressing hard. Safe. A word Ethan rarely said. And it wasn't because of him, it was because of Malik. The flight attendant who had once suggested restraints now blinked back tears herself. She touched Richard's arm lightly. "Sir, your son is lucky. And so are you." Her words carried no judgment, only truth. Richard turned to Malik again. His voice cracked, softer than it had been in years. "Thank you." The words were foreign to him, heavy with sincerity. For a man had built his life on being untouchable. Admitting gratitude to a boy society would overlook was harder than any deal he had ever closed. Malik shook his head, glancing back at Ethan. "Don't thank me, just be there for him. That's all he needs." His answer was simple, but it held the weight of wisdom men twice his age had never understood. Richard leaned back, his polished image stripped away. For the first time since his wife's death, he allowed himself to feel not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, but as a father who still had so much to learn. The passengers around him, once restless, now watched in reverent silence. They weren't just witnessing a boy calming another boy. They were witnessing a man discovering what it meant to truly love without control. Above the clouds, 30,000 feet in the air, something shifted. It wasn't just Ethan finding calm. It was Richard facing the truth he had buried under money and pride. Sometimes the richest man in the room has the poorest understanding of what really matters. And sometimes the poorest boy carries the richest gift of all. And as the plane cut steadily through the endless blue, the lives of three people, one wealthy, one fragile, one overlooked, were bound together by a single toy car that had turned chaos into peace. Landing with new eyes, the hours passed slowly, but the cabin no longer felt heavy with judgment. Ethan stayed calm, his toy car rolling back and forth across the tray table as though it were the only road that mattered. Malik stayed close, not hovering, not intruding, just present. The boy's quiet presence had become a shield, protecting Ethan from the world's noise. Richard sat watching, silent, humbled in a way he had never known. When the captain announced the descent into Chicago, the passengers stirred with relief. But this time, the air was different. No one sighed impatiently. No one complained. Every pair of eyes that had once judged now carried respect for the poor boy who had done what no one else could. Even the businessman who had snapped earlier leaned forward slightly, his voice awkward but sincere. "Kid, you did good. Better than the rest of us put together." Malik lowered his gaze, uncomfortable with praise. "I just helped," he whispered. His modesty only deepened the impression he left on everyone watching. As the wheels touched the runway and the plane rumbled to a stop, Richard reached into his jacket pocket. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out a sleek business card engraved with his name in silver. "Malik," he said softly, holding it out. "If you ever need anything, call me. I mean anything." His voice was sincere, stripped of pride. Malik blinked, staring at the card. He hesitated before taking it, his small fingers brushing against the Millionaire's. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he felt the weight of it. A door had opened, one he never expected to see. The flight attendants helped passengers disembark. Normally, Richard would have rushed off first, eager to escape stares, but today he waited. He let Malik walk ahead with his faded backpack, the zipper still held together with safety pins. Watching him go, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Ethan clutched the toy car tightly as they stepped into the terminal. He looked up at his father, his eyes wide but calmer than before, and in the smallest, quietest voice he whispered, "Friend." Richard froze. His son had spoken again, and not about cars or noise, but about the boy who had changed everything. Richard swallowed hard, tears threatening. "Yes, Ethan," he whispered back. "Friend." For Malik, there was no applause, no cameras, no fame waiting outside the terminal. Just the long walk toward an uncertain future with an aunt he barely knew. Yet he carried something priceless with him, a story that had changed not only a child's flight, but a father's heart. Richard Hale, the man who once believed money solved everything, would never forget that day. Not the judgmental stares, not the humiliation of his son's screams, but the way a poor boy's kindness rewrote the entire story. For the rest of his life, whenever business partners praised his genius or magazines wrote about his wealth, Richard would think back to that moment in the sky and remember, true wealth is not counted in dollars, but in compassion. As Ethan held his toy car close and whispered again, "Safe," Richard finally understood. The world had judged his son. He had judged Malik, and all of them had been wrong. Because sometimes the smallest hands carry the greatest power. Sometimes the poorest boy teaches the richest man what it means to love. And sometimes instant karma is not punishment at all. It's grace arriving when you least expect it. The flight was over, but the lesson had just begun.